Few figures in history ignite as much passion and controversy as Karl Marx. To some, he was a visionary, the father of modern socialism, a man who dared to challenge the economic systems that had shaped the world for centuries. To others, he was the architect of destruction, whose ideas fueled some of the most oppressive regimes in history. But regardless of how he is seen, one fact is undeniable: his theories changed the world. Marx was not a ruler. He did not lead armies. He never held political office. And yet, more than a century after his death, his name still stirs debate. His ideas have led to revolutions, toppled governments, and shaped the lives of billions. Nations have risen and fallen in his name. And even today, as the world faces economic inequality, political unrest, and corporate domination, his theories continue to resurface. But who was Karl Marx really? Was he a misunderstood intellectual whose ideas were twisted by those who followed him? Or were his theories always destined to lead to chaos? To answer that, we must go back, not just to his writings, but to the world that shaped him, the struggles that defined him, and the vision that made him one of the most divisive philosophers in history. The world Karl Marx was born into was one of extremes. On the surface, Europe in the early 19th century was thriving. The Industrial Revolution had transformed economies, bringing new technologies, railways, and factories. Cities grew rapidly, and wealth poured into the hands of the elite. It was an age of unprecedented economic expansion, where fortunes were made overnight, and industrial empires were built from nothing. But beneath this progress lay a dark and brutal reality. The very machines that powered industry also trapped millions in endless cycles of poverty. Factory workers toiled for 16 hours a day in hazardous conditions, their lungs filled with soot, their hands scarred from relentless labor. Child labor was common, with boys and girls as young as 6 working in mines and textile mills, their lives spent in near servitude for the profit of the wealthy elite. The ruling class, made up of aristocrats and industrialists, lived in luxury. Their wealth was built on the backs of laborers who barely survived on starvation wages. It was a world where a small group controlled nearly everything, while the masses struggled to survive. The rich were growing richer, and the poor were growing more desperate. And beneath the surface, something was boiling, a sense of injustice that would one day explode into revolution. Karl Marx was born into this world on May 5, 1818, in Trier, a small city in what is now Germany. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a respected lawyer, well-educated and wealthy enough to provide his son with the best education available. Young Karl was brilliant, excelling in studies of law, philosophy, and history. But unlike his classmates, he did not dream of wealth or political power. Instead, he was drawn to the struggles of the common people, the workers, the poor, the ones who suffered while others thrived. It was during his years as a student in Berlin that Marx's radicalization began. He immersed himself in the works of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a philosopher who argued that history was shaped by struggle. Marx took this idea further. He believed history was not just shaped by ideas, but by economic forces, by class conflict, by the battle between the rich and the poor. This belief would define the rest of his life. But how does a man go from being a student of philosophy to becoming the most feared thinker of his time? Karl Marx was never content with simply discussing ideas. He wanted action. He saw poverty, suffering, and injustice, and he believed that the only way to change the world was through revolution. He began writing articles for radical newspapers, attacking the government, criticizing capitalism, and calling for workers to rise against their oppressors. His words were sharp, his arguments relentless. And they did not go unnoticed. By the time Marx was in his mid-20s, he had already been forced to flee Germany. His writings had made him a target. The authorities saw him as dangerous, a threat to the existing order. But exile did not stop him. If anything, it fueled his resolve. In Paris, he found himself at the center of a radical intellectual community, surrounded by anarchists, socialists, and revolutionaries. It was here that he met Friedrich Engels, the man who would become his closest collaborator, his co-author, and the financier of his most important works. Engels was the son of a wealthy industrialist, but unlike his father, he despised the system that made him rich. He had seen firsthand the brutal conditions of factory workers and believed Marx was right. Capitalism was built on exploitation. Together, Marx and Engels began to refine their ideas, developing what would become known as scientific socialism, a theory that claimed history was moving toward an inevitable revolution. They believed that capitalism, no matter how powerful it seemed, would eventually collapse under its own weight. The working class, driven to desperation, would rise up, overthrow the ruling elite, and create a new system where wealth was shared equally. But their ideas were not just theories. They were a call to action. And soon, they would put their vision into words that would shake the world. By the mid-1840s, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had developed a radical vision that challenged everything about the world they lived in. They believed that history was not driven by ideas or kings but by class struggle, the constant battle between the ruling elite and the working masses. Marx argued that the rich did not simply earn their wealth, it was built by exploiting the labor of the working class. In 1847, they were approached by a group called the Communist League, a secret organization of revolutionaries. The League had a simple request. Marx and Engels needed to write a document that explained their vision of communism in clear, direct language. A revolutionary manifesto that could inspire workers across Europe to rise up. The result was the Communist Manifesto, a 23-page pamphlet that would change the world. It was published in February 1848, and it was nothing short of a declaration of war. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. With this opening line, Marx made it clear, human civilization had always been about one thing, the fight between those who have power and those who don't. He claimed that capitalism was just another phase of history, and like the feudal lords before them, the ruling class, whom he called the bourgeoisie, would one day be overthrown by the proletariat, the working class. The manifesto did not just predict revolution, it called for it. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. These words would echo across history. But at the time, Marx and Engels had no idea just how much impact they would have. Just weeks after the pamphlet was published, revolution broke out across Europe. The year 1848 saw a wave of uprisings that spread like wildfire across the continent. In France, Italy, Germany, and Austria, workers took to the streets, demanding better wages, shorter hours, and the right to vote. Kings were overthrown, governments collapsed, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Marx's predictions were coming true. But revolutions are not won with words alone. Despite the initial victories, the uprisings were crushed one by one. Monarchs and ruling elites, shocked by the scale of the protests, struck back with overwhelming force. Thousands were executed, imprisoned, or exiled. By the end of the year, the old order had been restored. For Marx, this was a brutal lesson. The Communist Manifesto had predicted the rise of the working class, but it had not anticipated the power of the ruling elite to strike back. Marx had hoped that workers would overthrow capitalism in one great uprising. Instead, they had been divided, disorganized, and ultimately defeated. Marx himself was now a hunted man. He was expelled from Belgium, then Germany, then France. By 1849, he found himself in London, the capital of the British Empire, a city filled with wealth, industry, and poverty beyond imagination. Exile, however, did not mean defeat. If anything, it gave Marx more time to refine his theories. And from the shadows, he began writing the book that would define his legacy. Living in poverty in London, Marx devoted himself to his most ambitious work yet, a complete, scientific analysis of capitalism itself. He spent years studying the economy, reading reports, analyzing market trends, and tracking how wealth moved through society. What he discovered would become Das Kapital, his most famous and influential book. Published in 1867, Das Kapital was not a call to revolution like the Communist Manifesto. Instead, it was a massive, deeply analytical work, one that sought to prove why capitalism would inevitably collapse. Marx argued that capitalism was built on a fundamental contradiction. It needed workers to produce goods, but it also needed to keep wages low to maximize profit. This, he claimed, would lead to inequality, economic crises, and eventually revolution. He introduced the concept of surplus value. The idea that capitalists became rich by paying workers less than the true value of their labor. He explained how businesses would compete against each other, driving wages lower, forcing companies to expand, and creating a system where wealth concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. The rich will get richer, the poor will get poorer, and capitalism will dig its own grave. To many, this was a terrifying prophecy. To others, it was a brilliant insight into the mechanics of wealth and power. But Das Kapital was not an instant success. In fact, it was barely read at the time of its publication. It was long, complex, and filled with economic theories that most workers could not understand. Yet, Marx was convinced that history was on his side. "I am not writing for today," he once said. "I am writing for the future." And he was right. Because while Das Kapital did not spark revolutions in his lifetime, it would become the foundation of every communist movement in the 20th century. But Marx would not live to see it. His health was failing, his finances were in ruins, and despite his fame among revolutionaries, he died in near obscurity in 1883. He was buried in Highgate Cemetery in London, his grave marked with the words, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world, in various ways." The point, however, is to change it. But Marx's story did not end with his death. In fact, it was just beginning. Because the ideas he left behind would soon spread across the world, leading to revolutions, the rise of superpowers, and some of the most brutal conflicts in human history. The rise of Marxism after his death. Karl Marx died in 1883, largely unnoticed by the world. He had no government power, no army, no political office. And yet, his ideas would soon spread farther than even he could have imagined. By the late 19th century, socialist movements were growing across Europe. Workers, inspired by Marx's vision, were demanding better wages, shorter hours, and the right to vote. Labor unions, once weak and ignored, were now forcing governments to listen. Socialists were being elected into parliaments, passing new laws to protect workers from exploitation. But Marx's vision was never about reform. It was about revolution. And that revolution was coming. The first major sign of Marx's influence appeared in Russia. Under the rule of the Tsars, the Russian Empire was a land of extreme wealth and crushing poverty. While aristocrats lived in luxury, millions of peasants and factory workers lived in filth, barely surviving. One man saw an opportunity. His name was Vladimir Lenin, and he believed that Marx's vision could become reality. Unlike Marx, Lenin was not content with waiting for capitalism to collapse on its own. He wanted action. In 1917, in the chaos of World War I, Lenin and his followers, known as the Bolsheviks, seized power in Russia, overthrowing the Tsar and establishing the first Marxist state. For the first time in history, a government ruled in the name of Marx's ideas. But was this the workers' paradise Marx had envisioned? Or was something darker emerging? The Russian Revolution was just the beginning. Marx's ideas now had a home, a government that could spread them across the globe. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, pushed Marxism further than ever before. Private property was abolished, industries were taken over by the state, and class divisions were supposed to disappear. But the reality was different. Instead of empowering workers, the Soviet Union became a brutal dictatorship. Stalin ruled with an iron fist, purging anyone who opposed him, sending millions to prison camps in Siberia. The revolution that had started with dreams of equality had turned into a nightmare of oppression. Yet, despite the horrors of Stalinism, Marxism continued to spread. China, 1949, Mao Zedong led a communist revolution, overthrowing the government and creating a new Marxist state. Cuba, 1959, Fidel Castro took power, inspired by Marx and Lenin, challenging the dominance of the US in the Western Hemisphere. Vietnam, Korea, Eastern Europe, one by one, nations turned red, embracing Marx's ideas in different forms. By the mid-20th century, nearly half the world lived under governments that claimed to follow Marxist principles. The Cold War began, a global conflict between capitalism and communism, between the US and the Soviet Union. The battle was not just about military power, it was a battle of ideas. But was this what Karl Marx had wanted? Or had his theories been twisted beyond recognition? By the 1980s, the cracks in the Marxist world were starting to show. The Soviet Union, once powerful, was struggling. Its economy was collapsing, its people were restless, and its leaders were out of touch. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, signaling the end of communism in Eastern Europe. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, bringing an end to the world's largest Marxist state. China, though still officially communist, had taken a different path. Under Deng Xiaoping, China embraced capitalism while maintaining tight political control. The economy boomed, lifting millions out of poverty, but at the cost of political freedom. By the 21st century, most of the world had abandoned Marxist-style communism. Capitalism had won. Or had it? Even today, Marx's ideas remain relevant. His critiques of capitalism, rising inequality, corporate control, economic crises, are still debated. In countries across the world, politicians and activists still invoke his name, arguing that capitalism is failing and that a new system is needed. So the question remains: was Karl Marx right all along? Or was he the most dangerous philosopher in history? More than 140 years after his death, Karl Marx remains one of the most discussed thinkers in history. Some argue that his ideas were deeply flawed, leading to economic failure and oppressive regimes. But others insist that Marx was not wrong, he was simply ahead of his time. His greatest prediction was that capitalism would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. He argued that the system would concentrate wealth in fewer and fewer hands, leaving the majority struggling. Today, critics of capitalism point to growing wealth inequality, the dominance of corporate monopolies, and the rise of automation replacing workers as proof that Marx's warnings were accurate. Marx believed that capitalism's greatest flaw was its inability to provide stability. He described the boom and bust cycles, periods of economic growth followed by devastating crashes, leaving millions unemployed. The financial crisis of 2008, where reckless corporate greed led to a global recession, is often cited as an example of Marx's theories in action. Even today, movements calling for higher wages, universal healthcare, and wealth redistribution echo Marx's vision of a world without economic exploitation. His ideas are still alive in political debates, academic discussions, and protests around the world. But if Marx's analysis of capitalism was correct, does that mean his solution, communism, was the right answer? While many agree that Marx was a brilliant critic of capitalism, his solutions remain deeply controversial. The 20th century saw multiple nations attempt to implement his vision, and the results were often catastrophic. The Soviet Union, what began as a Marxist-inspired revolution, led to one of the most oppressive regimes in history. Under Stalin, millions were sent to labor camps, political dissenters were executed, and the government controlled every aspect of life. Mao's China, the attempt to rapidly industrialize under communism led to the Great Famine, where over 30 million people starved to death, one of the worst human-made disasters in history. Cambodia's killing fields, the Khmer Rouge inspired by Marxist thought, attempted to create a classless society by forcing people into labor camps. Nearly a quarter of the population was killed in the process. Critics argue that Marx's ideas are too idealistic, ignoring basic human nature. They claim that eliminating private property and centralizing power in the hands of the state leads not to equality, but to dictatorship. But defenders of Marx argue that these governments misinterpreted his ideas. Marx never described exactly how communism should be implemented, he only analyzed capitalism. So, was the failure of communism a result of Marx's ideas themselves, or their misuse by those in power? Despite the failures of past communist states, Marxism has not disappeared. In fact, in recent years, interest in his ideas has surged. In the wake of economic crises, rising inequality, and corporate dominance, many activists are revisiting Marx's critique of capitalism. Politicians in countries like the US, the UK, and across Europe have proposed socialist policies like higher taxes on the wealthy, free healthcare, and workers' rights reforms, often citing Marxist thought. New movements, such as democratic socialism, attempt to mix Marxist ideals with modern democracy, arguing that the state can regulate capitalism rather than destroy it completely. Others believe Marx's concept of class struggle is playing out in modern debates about race, gender, and wealth distribution. But critics warn that history has already tested these ideas, and they failed. They argue that capitalism has survived precisely because it can evolve, unlike rigid Marxist states. So, is the world heading toward another Marxist revolution? Or will his ideas remain just a theory, a warning from history, rather than a blueprint for the future? Regardless of the answer, one fact remains. Karl Marx changed the world. But was it for better or worse? And is his revolution still to come? For over 150 years, Karl Marx's ideas have shaped history, inspired revolutions, and ignited endless debate. His vision was clear: a world where workers were no longer exploited, where wealth was shared, where capitalism would collapse under its own weight. But did his predictions come true? Some say yes. They point to the growing gap between the rich and poor, the rise of corporate monopolies, and the increasing struggle of workers in the modern world. They argue that Marx saw the future long before anyone else. That capitalism has become exactly what he warned about, a system that thrives on inequality. Others say no. They argue that Marx's ideas failed every time they were put into practice. That his theories ignored human nature, leading to brutal regimes and economic disasters. That capitalism, despite its flaws, has adapted, evolved, and lifted millions out of poverty in ways Marx could never have predicted. But whether you agree with him or not, one thing is undeniable: Karl Marx's ideas are still alive. His theories continue to fuel political debates, inspire social movements, and challenge the economic order of the world. So, as we look around at the modern world, rising economic inequality, global financial crises, automation replacing jobs, and protests demanding change, the real question is not whether Karl Marx was right or wrong. The real question is, are his ideas making a comeback? Because history has shown us one thing: revolutions never truly end. And Marx's revolution may still be waiting. Engaging the audience and the next chapter. Karl Marx remains one of the most divisive figures in history. Some see him as a visionary, a man who fought for justice and equality. Others see him as a dangerous thinker, whose ideas led to some of the darkest chapters in history. But what do you think? Was Karl Marx a prophet of the working class, or was he responsible for some of history's greatest disasters? Was his vision of a classless society realistic, or was it doomed to fail from the start? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this journey through history fascinating, be sure to check out our deep dive into the Russian Revolution, how Marx's ideas took over a nation. A story of revolution, betrayal, and power struggles. Click here to watch now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode of our deep explorations into history's greatest thinkers and most controversial ideas. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what happens next.